My name is Patrick. I am a part of the partnerships team here at Effective Altruism Unimeld. With me today is my co-host, Stella. Stella, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody.
Great. So I'm going to just be doing a brief introduction before I hand over to Emily, and then Stella is going to be handling the Q&A part of today. So first off, I would just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge that I'm currently standing on Indigenous land where I am. That's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, future, and emerging. Great, so let's get started. So the way that today is going to run is we've got Emily Grundy here. She's going to be giving us about a 20-minute presentation on what works to reduce animal welfare consumption. So Emily is a behavioral scientist. She works at BehaviourWorks Australia, and she's also been volunteering at the Rapid Effective Action Development Initiative for a couple of years now. So as part of Emily's work, one of the initiatives that she did at READI, as it is called, was a research project into various initiatives that worked to behavioral initiatives to reduce animal consumption. And she's going to be taking us through her work and also taking us through some of the results of her findings. And also, I think, just giving us a bit of an insight into what behavioral science is like in general. Emily also completed an honours in psychology at Melbourne University in 2019 and has been an active part of the Effective Altruism network ever since. So it's really great to have Emily here, one of our, I guess, a long-term member of Effective Altruism Unimeld, coming back. She's gone into the big wide world and has made some really great strides in her time. So it's going to be really exciting today to hear about her work. So I'll hand it over to Emily.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Patrick. I will just share my screen. Cool. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see PowerPoint? Sweet, that's a lot of thumbs. Okay, so yeah, my name's Emily and I'm part of READI, which is a volunteer research collaboration that conducts behaviour science research to address pressing global problems. And with READI, recently I've been leading a meta review on this question: what works when you're trying to reduce animal product consumption? And I've been doing that with a team of about 22 other authors, so it's been a bit of an effort, and yeah, here to tell you about it today. So what I'll go through today is just give some background info on what a meta review is, because you might not have heard of it, and then talk about what it is that we did, why we did it, and what we found. So starting at like the basics, when you're trying to get people to change their behavior, and you've probably just experienced this in your life, or you're trying to get yourself to like change your own behavior, you probably know that it can be really hard. And so people have like a number of different preferences and habits and beliefs and traditions that all like mesh together and make it a hard thing to do sometimes. What can make it easier is looking to do things or to implement certain things that have evidence behind them. So things that other people have done or yourself has done in the past, and it's like been effective at changing behavior, and then implementing those and then hoping it has like the same results moving forward. So then we come up against this idea, which is like, where do we go to find that evidence, or what evidence should we be searching for? And then we see that there are like different types of evidence and that they're not all equal. So if we take an example of trying to build a meditation practice, you might want to start meditating and you don't want to just like give up after a week. You want it to be like a sustained practice. And you're trying to think about, okay, like what can I do? What can I implement to ensure that it's a sustained practice and it happens over time? One thing you can do, or like an piece of evidence you can search for, is just anecdotal. So you might ask family members or friends who have a meditation practice and ask them like, what works for you? You know, how have you been able to do it for like X months? And they might say things like, oh, I use this app and this app is really good, and that means I keep meditating. And so that sort of evidence can be really useful because those people probably know you and they probably know like your style of thinking or like what helps you stick to certain habits, but it can also like have a number of issues. One of which being it's usually a small sample. So it might just be asking 1 or 2 people for their advice. And there are also a number of like quality issues. So it could be that, you know, one friend says, this app's really good. This has made me meditate for ages. But it could be that they also went on like a meditation retreat at the same time that they started using the app. And it's actually like the meditation retreat is, you know, enhancing their meditation practice. So there's like a number of issues there where it's usually not very clear like what the causal effect is. Another place that you can look for evidence for is in research studies, and that could be something like a randomized controlled trial. So here you might be like reading a research study and it might be on, do apps work to sustain meditation practices? And what they might do is have like 50 participants, and they might split those participants in 2 and give one group an app and one group no app, and then document like, you know, how much they meditate or how long they meditate for. And that's like much better than anecdotal evidence usually, because you can compare those groups and it's like a very controlled environment. But there can still be some issues. So it could be that if you're focusing on a single study, it still might not be enough participants to try and like take out a generalizable finding and apply that to your life. And it also might be that because you're just focusing on one study, there could be some sort of like peculiarities about that study. So maybe they used a particular measure or a really specific app, which means it won't generalize. So then like moving up even higher quality and what is usually like the top of like hierarchy of evidence, systematic reviews. So in randomized control trials, you're usually collecting data from individual participants. But in systematic reviews, you're collecting primary studies and you're aggregating all the data that those studies bring, and then you're drawing conclusions based on those studies. So if you look at this diagram, it's like you have all these triangles, which are the studies. They go through this systematic review process and then out spits like usually an academic paper, which synthesizes all those findings. And this can be good because in the primary study, you might just like that single study, you might have 50 participants. But in the systematic review, you might have 50 studies, each of which have 50 participants. So then all up, if you aggregate that data, you might have like 2,500 participants, which is like a bigger sample and more reliable if you're trying to draw conclusions from it. So then the final step, and it gets a bit like Inception here. So this is a meta review, and that's where the unit of data that you're collecting is systematic reviews. And so it sounds a bit ridiculous, but there are a number of advantages to conducting meta reviews. One is that in a systematic review, there's usually quite a narrow focus. And so it might be like, it's collecting all the primary studies on how apps affect meditation practices. And it has to have quite a specific process or like inclusion criteria in order to collect like really specific primary studies. In a meta review though, you can be a lot broader and you can ask something like what works in general to promote meditation practices. And then you'll find that you have like different systematic reviews which might target different things. So meta reviews can be really useful for practitioners or policymakers because they summarize the review level evidence in a really accessible way. So a meta review, like that's what it is, but why did we choose a particular research question that we chose? So what we looked at was what interventions influence animal product consumption. And the reason we chose this question is that, I mean, you know, coming to this sort of group, you've probably thought about this kind of thing before, but there's a lot of research that suggests that moving towards a more plant-based diet can have like a whole range of benefits, and that can be for like public health, food security, animal welfare, conservation of biodiversity, the climate, and so on. And so there's like a bunch of evidence on, you know, this might be a good thing to do, obviously depending on certain circumstances and like what country you're in or your background or whatever. And there also needs to be that match on like, okay, if this is a good thing to do, how do we actually get people to do it? Because it's a very different thing like just knowing that something is a good thing to do, and then like actually doing it. Like you probably know that you should get, you know, over 8 hours sleep a night, but you're probably going to stay up to like 12 a.m. doing something and then regret it the next day, like every day. So it's like, that's where that having that behavior change insight can be really valuable. Also, we chose this because existing systematic reviews in this area can have a narrow focus. So some might focus on like just looking at, you know, what works to reduce meat consumption, or like what interventions are effective in like a supermarket context versus a restaurant context. Like it can be really specific. And we thought that having some sort of accessible synthesis would be really useful. And then it's also dependent on the interest of our team. So we're like a volunteer organization, and we have like a sort of a junior research team who are like learning all these research skills, and we want them to be interested and like contribute to the work. So it also was dependent on, you know, them being interested in this topic. So in terms of what we found a variety of evidence for different interventions. So I'm just going to speak about the interventions we found like the most amount of evidence for. And there's a really important caveat to make, which is these interventions aren't necessarily like better than other interventions. It's just that we found the most amount of evidence for them. So it could be that for some reason people aren't studying, you know, other interventions as much, and there could be like other factors influencing that. So in terms of one of our strongest findings, which was that we found evidence for providing information on the environmental impacts of animal products, especially meat, can reduce consumption. So looking at like the broader literature, there are a number of things to keep in mind if you're thinking about using this approach. So like trying to present environmental arguments to people in order to convince them to reduce their animal product consumption. One is that the demographics or the background of your audience can matter. So environmental arguments can be more effective for some groups like university students, so maybe you guys, than it might be for others. Another is that prior beliefs and thoughts of your audience also can matter. So if you're speaking to someone who thinks that meat is like really climate friendly, then probably intuitively you know that that might not be the best like argument to present to them. And that's like something that the research supports as well, like thinking about those prior beliefs and how someone might interpret what you're saying. And that's also like, speaking beyond the literature, that's also a really hard thing to balance, because sometimes it can be useful to correct people on their beliefs and sort of push back a little. And I think that's where it can be important to think about like who you're speaking to. Is it a friend? Are they very open-minded? Are they very like, oh, if you present the evidence, they'll change their mind? Or are they just committed to the idea that they have in their mind and are unlikely to change and just might get defensive? So it's really important to think about just like, who are you speaking to? And then a third consideration is the framing of the information. So some researchers have found that often when we present environmental arguments around animal product consumption, they can be quite detached and quite unemotional. And I feel this pull as well. And you see it like on blog posts and everything. It's like, oh, every day X-sized football fields being cleared for livestock and that sort of thing. And maybe that would be effective for some people, but it's also can be really effective to bring some emotion and some value-based language into the picture. So yeah, in summary, for environmental impacts or arguments, you got to think about like who you're talking to, what are they thinking, or like what do they believe, and then also like how are you saying what you're saying. Moving on to another finding, which is on thinking or communicating about the health impacts of animal product consumption. God, I'm like tired of saying that phrase for so long. So this can also be an effective tactic. And again, I'll just like go through some of the considerations that you could keep in mind. So this again won't work for everyone. And some of the reasons it might not work is if people are really resistant to change and think that meat is healthy and necessary, for health. Also, that if they think the consequences of consumption are quite trivial, like it doesn't really matter. It might be like a small effect, but not a big one. And also if they have reduced their consumption in the past and therefore think like, oh, I've already done that, like I don't need to do it reduce it any further. It can be particularly effective, this kind of argument, for older consumers or people who already have pre-existing negative perceptions about like meat consumption. And again, this is like quite similar to the environmental arguments. It's like thinking about who you're talking to, what are they already thinking, and how does like what you're saying, like how strongly does it align or not align with what they're already thinking. So moving on to maybe just in terms of time, the last, one of the biggest final findings, is about communicating dynamic social norms. So you've probably heard about social norms before. They're like the unwritten rules that govern what attitudes and beliefs and behaviors are acceptable in a given social group or like culture. And usually what you're doing when communicating about norms is you're saying like, the majority of people are doing X, you should also do X. So you can sort of see how this happens in the messaging around COVID. It's like, you know, majority of people now have got like 1 dose of the vaccine, and that is used as like a push, like, okay, if you want to be part of the majority, get like your dose of the vaccine. This gets a little tricky with things like trying to convince people to adopt a plant-based diet, because people who are vegetarian or vegan are a very small minority of the population. It's usually like 2 to 5%, I think. So what you can instead do is communicate about dynamic social norms. And so this focuses on how the norms are changing over time, rather than like what, you know, given percentage of a population is vegetarian or vegan at a certain point. So yeah, say in 2016, 2% of the group on the screen is vegetarian, and then in 2021, 4% is. Instead of saying, oh, 4% of this group currently is vegetarian, what you could say is that the number of vegetarians in the group has doubled over the past 5 years. And this prompts people into thinking that like the norms are changing, and that essentially like they better get on board with, you know, what the latest trend is. So in terms of what we didn't find, it's meta reviews and systematic reviews can be difficult, because no matter how rigorous your review is, your findings are always going to be dependent on the quality of your included data. So the quality of your included primary studies, or in our case, the quality of your included systematic reviews. So in our case, the systematic reviews that we included and synthesized, they didn't really conduct much quantitative syntheses. So usually in systematic reviews, this would be something like a meta-analysis, which is where like you're aggregating all this data from your primary studies, and then you can do things like say, oh, across all these studies, the effect size was this, and it was significant, and this is like, you know, an intervention that you should implement. So our included reviews didn't do that. And so therefore that restricted us in how well we could synthesize the data that they presented us with. And so that's definitely something that moving forward would be really good to see in research in this area, is like trying to describe the literature, but also like add, you know, statistical rigor to it, and also, you know, reporting transparency and all these other things you hear about in EA as well. So another thing we didn't really find was reviews that focused on animal products other than meat. It seems like meat is like the main one, and it sort of makes sense. That's probably historically, that's been the one that's been like, you know, front and center for the longest amount of time. And so we found some reviews that were focused on dairy consumption, but it was always like how to increase dairy consumption. So like how to get kids drinking milk rather than how to decrease it. And so we did like kind of synthesize the data on how to increase consumption, because we thought that could be useful. It's like, if you know that subsidies are really useful for increasing dairy consumption, then, you know, you can kind of flip that and say, okay, maybe if you remove the subsidies, that might decrease consumption. But yeah, I think in future, probably it would be good to see studies on things other than meat. And it could be like that those primary studies exist, but they're just not getting picked up by the systematic reviews, which means there might be like an issue with the search strategy they're using. And so that could be something that could be corrected in future. Yeah, in terms of where to find out more info, we've got a preprint. So we're currently in the process of submitting our paper to a journal, and unfortunately that's always like takes a very long time. But you can read the preprint, which we put online. You can also see our website, and if you're also keen to join one of these kinds of projects in the future, we have like a sign up form, and I'll just like link all this in chat. So how our reviews usually work is there's like a research lead. So in this case, it was me. There's also an advisory board, which is like expert researchers or practitioners in the field, and they give advice to us on, you know, our research direction and our research methods, and like the manuscript, and, you know, synthesizing it all together. But then there's also that research team. And so that might be people in uni, or like who want to go into research or want to build their research skills. And what we do is essentially like train you up, and then, you know, doing things like screening articles and extracting data and helping out with the write-up. So if that sounds something that you'd be interested in, then by all means fill out the form. I think we have a project planned for toward the end of this year or the start of next year on institutional decision making. So yeah, if that's something that sounds interesting to you, then get on board. Love to hear from you. That's all from me.
All right, thanks so much, Emily. I guess we'll get the Q&A started. We have a lot of questions, which is awesome. I'll go by popularity, if that's okay with everyone. First one with 5 upvotes is, was there any research done into animal cruelty-based arguments? And if so, what sort of impact did that have?
Yeah, so there was some things on like conveying the animal welfare impacts, and they were mostly like had a positive result, as in like they worked, but there wasn't very many of them. So some of the things that have been looked at in the literature are like reminding people of the animal, like the live animal origins of meat. So that can be things like before they eat a meal, like showing them a picture of a cow that's like heading to slaughter, or like presenting them with a recipe and then having a picture of like, you know, a cute animal next to it. So yeah, some of those things were effective, but like the data, there wasn't enough of them to like kind of aggregate and say, you know, in total, we would endorse it. It definitely could be something that's effective, and I would assume like that many of the other caveats that hold for, say, environmental or health arguments would also hold for that. So it's like, you know, if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe that animals can feel pain, it's probably not going to be an effective argument to present to them.
Yeah, definitely. The next question is, do you believe that behavioral science is a potentially high impact career path to pursue? And if so, which subsets are most high impact?
Well, I'm biased, obviously. So yes. Yeah, I think it is, especially if you're interested in it. Like, to me, it's like really fascinating. But I also think there are many other high impact careers. Yeah, so I think it really depends on personal fit. But I think for me, it's like you can have all those, you know, really base theory or like understanding of how things work. But then if you're not actually applying it in the real world, like what's the point? Like you can understand what the most cost effective charities are, but if you don't know how to encourage people to donate to charity, like how far are you going to get? So like that's more of an emotional argument. So I probably just brought some of you on board with an emotional argument. But yeah, I think it is.
I mean, I've heard that there's a few EAs working at BehaviourWorks now, aren't there, Emily?
We're
So-
definitely recruiting people to trying to just like take over institutions with EAs. So
yeah. So it's possibly one endorsement of it as a pretty EA endorsed area.
All right. Next question is, do I need to have prior experience to join READI, which is related to this new recruiting effort, I guess?
no, you don't. So pretty much it's just like, yeah, if you're interested in research, you're interested in EA, you're keen to contribute like some of your time. It is like volunteer, as I said, but yeah, the whole idea I think is trying to get past this idea that to apply for a job, you need to have experience, but then like, how do you get a job in the first place? And also like building the EA research community and just like, yeah, giving a bunch of people who want to learn research skills. So no, you don't need prior experience.
That's awesome. And I love that breaking down of, you know, needing experience when it's so hard to get experience. That one has 4 upvotes, so you know, if you get 4 applications, then you know it's from. The next question is, did you find any evidence of environmental arguments causing people to swap from beef to chicken or pork?
So no, we didn't have like specific data on that. Just thinking about it, I would like assume that that could be effective. But no, there was no like research data that we found on that.
Okay, next one is, can you recommend any systematic reviews on how to best encourage charitable giving?
So we actually did a review, like the same, like the meta review of what works to promote like philanthropy or charitable giving. So I will try and find that now and link it in the chat. Or actually, it's probably on our website too.
Yeah, awesome. And we will send, some, oh, there you go. Some of the links are there. Cool. Next question. I think I haven't asked this one. From this research, what do you think are the most promising future directions for reducing animal products in terms of animal welfare?
I think this research isn't enough to say like what works definitively. And so my answer would probably be like an annoying one of like improve the quality of the research. Because again, I think it's one of those things where you can do as much research as you want, but if it's not high quality, then your conclusions might not be very reliable and like they may be misleading. So it would, be more like a research focused idea of like improving the transparency of what methods you're using, as well as like the rigor and how you're synthesizing the results that you're getting.
Yeah, awesome. And one of the next questions is, in terms of behavioral science, what is the advantage of doing meta reviews as opposed to experimental behavior studies?
So there can be advantages to doing either. Experimental studies, it's like you're creating something new. And so if you have a particular theory or like you've got evidence that something will work and you want to test that directly, then you could do your own study where it's like you might do a randomized control trial and like test out whether, you know, giving this information reduces consumption as opposed to giving nothing. But one thing that I don't know if it's neglected, but probably can be overlooked is that there can be a lot of existing information already out there. And I think it's talked about in EA as well, like trying to create these central directories of information. But yeah, one thing you can do is like just synthesize the existing information to like put out a better understanding of like, okay, what do we know so far? And then that can like in turn prompt more experimental studies, because it might be like, oh, we know this about this sort of thing, and there's like no information about this. And so then people might go out and do like studies on that. So I think it's like, it depends what your intention is, and there are like definitely reasons to do either or both.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another one is most of the behavior change interventions here are mostly communication related. What forms of media worked better or worse for you? For example, TV, ads, Instagram, etc.
So yeah, we didn't find reviews that compared mediums like that, which is really unfortunate. Though there is some like primary studies, so just like surveys of people who are already vegetarian or vegan and asking them like what made them make that dietary choice. And those studies, like just some of them have found that watching videos and documentaries is really effective. But also, I think the most effective thing that they found was having conversations with friends and family members, which is like, I find quite heartening, because sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm one person, you know, I don't have like $1 million to make a really great documentary. But then you think like, oh, sometimes you can have a lot of power in the way that you speak to people. And that's, to me, that sort of motivates this idea of like, okay, we have to think about how we should be speaking to people in order to promote these ideas. And it's not just about getting the information across. And yeah, definitely not just about like being some cathartic release of your anger about like other people's choices or whatever. But yeah, thinking about like what will work best, like how will they hear what you're saying, is really important.
Yeah, great. This kind of relates to the point you've been making about, you know, you can do as much research as you want, but if it's not being implemented properly, then nothing happens. Someone's asked, do you believe that your research can inform political movements too, insofar as how to rally people around a certain cause or gain traction around a cause?
I think probably our research isn't best placed to do that. I would think that the findings that we had were more like individual targeted, and I would think that trying to really target like a group movement would require like an understanding of more group dynamics than what we looked at. Like most of our interventions that we found were just targeting an individual, and usually, you know, from an individual to an individual, or from like a restaurant or a supermarket or whatever to an individual. So I would think that it's probably not the best for that.
Yep, that makes sense. Another question is, what research do you plan to do next, and what directions are you personally interested in exploring? And just to add to that, since there's been a lot of questions kind of relating to adjacent things like environmental arguments and animal cruelty arguments, is that you prioritize like which you think is most important to be researched right now and that you want to focus on?
So in terms of what we're doing next, so next we're looking at institutional decision making, something around that, maybe like what works to, influence institutional decision making or enhance it. And then personally, I think I'm pretty open in terms of like future research directions. I'm really interested just in general how behavior science can be used to promote effective altruism. And so that could include, you know, the vast array of things that effective altruism can include. So it might be like, you know, how do we get people to, especially like leaders or institutions, to think about the long-term future, because, you know, that can be difficult. Or it could be more things on like, how do we get people to donate effectively, or how do we get people to consider bio risks, or like think about how like AI, you know, risks that might come about because of AI. So I think I'm like, at the moment I'm pretty open, just in terms of like, the intersection of behavior science and EA. And then I forgot the second part of your question about animal welfare arguments, was it?
So just with because there's been a lot of questions about kind of like, is there like this aspect of, you know, behavioral science? Have you like looked into that, and how does like this relate to that? Is there a way that you kind of prioritize like what kind of examples that you use, like whether it's, you know, looking into different types of media, or like, you know, looking at how people respond to animal cruelty arguments and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think probably the way I'm thinking about it at the moment isn't super systematic, but I'd be really interested in looking at how alternatives influence consumption of meat, and especially things like cultured meat, because, or like, you know, cell-based dairy or whatever. Because yeah, we found that that wasn't really something that's been looked at in the literature. There's been some research on, you know, what might affect people's willingness to try cell-based products, but not much about like how that might influence their consumption of traditional animal products. And yeah, just personally, I see that, you know, cellular agriculture as being like a really big part of the future. And I think it's important to think about how that might affect consumption of traditional animal products, and like what might move people more towards that space rather than sticking with the traditional things.
All right, awesome. I might just take this point in the event to ask if anyone wants to make any comments or questions, like via voice or video chat. If not, then we'll just continue with the Slido. Everyone's being shy. All right, all good. Next question is, to what extent has your engagement in EA shaped or changed your career path?
Oh, nice one. So I would think pretty substantially. I learned about EA when I was in high school and read Peter Singer, which is like, he seems to be the gateway person for a lot of people. And yeah, ever since then, I've been thinking about like, what's the highest impact thing that I can do, but also trying to balance that with like, what things am I interested in? And like going through that eternal struggle of like, oh, maybe I should just like, you know, go and do this super high impact thing, which I'm not particularly interested in. And then like remembering, oh, but I'll probably like burn out, and I probably actually won't be that effective in the end if I do something that I'm not really interested in. So I think, yeah, I think it's influenced my career path, like the way I think about my career, in probably positive and like negative or like confusing ways. Just like trying to think about like, what do I enjoy, but also what might be good in terms of my impact. And also probably overthinking it a lot, like just thinking about it too much. I think sometimes it can lead to like that choice paralysis where you're like, I've got so many choices and maybe I won't do any of them. So yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. I think everyone kind of struggles with that a bit. Kale, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was going to ask Emily, do you think you would have gone into behavioral science if you didn't have these kind of EA considerations in your view?
I think I probably would have ended up there or somewhere similar. I think like I was kind of first introduced to behavior science when I met some of the people in READI at an EA conference a couple of years ago. And I've always been interested in like how people think and why they do the things they do. But that was like the thing that really got me in. So I think I would have ended up there eventually, but perhaps focusing on things which like were good, but maybe not good and effective.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. Just kind of tangentially to that, I was wondering, is there a way that EA has kind of influenced the way you live your life, such as, I guess, like the products you buy and the charities you donate to?
Yeah, so I think quite a bit. So yeah, like donating a portion of my income to charity. And then I think like just in terms of mindset, So like just that idea that you can be rigorous in the way that you think, and you don't have to like just buy into all these maybe like more emotion-based arguments just because they're appealing. It's like bringing this or making this idea of thinking about like, okay, what's the evidence behind that? Like more intuitive, just because, you know, you keep reading things about EA or hearing things about EA, and like it becomes like more habitual over time. So I think that in particular has been really influential for me, and as well just like talking to other people about it and trying to figure out like that balance between wanting to share ideas and like so other people can hear about them, but then also not wanting to overwhelm people, not wanting to make them feel bad about their choices, not wanting to push too much information on them. Yeah, so I think it's changed like my behavior in a number of ways.
Yeah, definitely. I guess we'll get back to the Slido a little bit. Another question is one of the dangers with meta reviews that you just get the most average insight as opposed to the most evidence-based or robust?
I think that concern is like in part addressed if you're doing more like statistical analyses on things. So you can do like what's called a meta-analysis, where like your systematic reviews might have done meta-analyses, but then you meta-analyze their data and like bring that all together. So I think that concern is in part alleviated by that. But yeah, it's possible that our findings are like influenced by that, or like that you know, it's possible that all the studies, like half the studies are going to one extreme and half the studies are going to the other, and then maybe they sort of like rule out each other and end up in the middle. And it's not like always when you synthesize data, you're getting rid of some of the nuance. And so that's like one of the disadvantages of doing something like a review, is that, you know, if you're moving away from that initial study, then you're probably going to lose like information, but that's just like a trade-off that you have to make.
Yeah, okay. Another question is, what other non-communication related behavior interventions have you found plausibly promising?
So we did find some on portion sizes. So that could be supermarkets selling small portion sizes of meat, and that actually like people end up buying the smaller size and the larger size, and then that ends up like reducing consumption. And also like restaurants serving smaller portions of meat and like increasing the portion of other things like vegetables. So that was pretty promising. And I think that was probably the main thing. I mean, another one which has come up, and I don't think it has a lot of studies to support it, but it has like one study which everyone cites, and it's like quite a rigorous study. And that's about giving people default plant-based menus or like meal options. And I suppose that sort of comes under communication, but it's also about nudging people, just like doing these things that, I mean, they don't explicitly like have to make a choice. It's like kind of altering the environment around them. And so, yeah, if you like say to people, oh, the default is this plant-based option, then people are, you know, less or not very likely to pick the meat option, and you know, it reduces consumption that way.
Yeah, I imagine those nudging effects play a huge role in enacting change. Another question is a bit of a tangent, but what is the research/EA view of using psychometrics as used by Cambridge Analytica, but for good purposes?
Ooh, I have no idea. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not too sure what
I'm not even
psychometrics
going to
are
try
either.
that one.
Yeah, all good. The last one we have is, I might have heard this wrongly, but did you say if one already has prior beliefs which are opposite to that of what you are persuading them of, then it'll backfire?
Yeah. So that can happen. So it can be that if people think like meat is really climate friendly, and then you tell them that it's not, then that can not necessarily backfire, but it just might have no effect. There's some like evidence that some things can lead to backfiring effects. People have like really strong opinions about the role that meat has, or like, you know, its attributes. So like telling them all this like information in the opposite direction of what they think can yeah, either have no effect or sometimes like push them a bit back the other way. But
yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I'll make this one the last question because it's a good time to wrap up. Someone just submitted it, so just nudge that one in. Were there any novel ideas separate from the 3 you mentioned in the presentation that seemed promising but lacked enough evidence for confidence?
yeah, so I think probably just the ones I mentioned around portion sizes and like having default vegan or vegetarian menus. They're probably like the 2 others which were more promising.
Yeah, easy. All right, so if anyone wants to learn more about this info, you can check out BehaviourWorks, which is Monash affiliated, READI and Rethink Priorities, which are both EA aligned, as far as I know, and all of which Emily has worked with or currently works with. There's the link for those. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, can I just briefly cut in? We did have one final question that Kieran wanted to ask. So, Kieran, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So the question I wanted to ask is, I think obviously from your studies, there's a lot of insights about what work in convincing people one-on-one. Would you say like a takeaway for us, you know, people who care about EA concerns, is obviously the logic and what makes sense is important too, but also developing like emotional intelligence to be able to, you know, communicate effectively with people. Do you think that, I mean, and also I wonder, like, in your experience too, have you found that to be something really important as well?
Yeah, for sure. I think effective altruism and like the community is like really great because of the emphasis it's placed on like evidence and rationality. I think sometimes it can be like maybe too much towards that sort of thing when communicating, and trying to bring like a personable like approach to it, or that values-based or emotion, like some sort of emotional approach to it can be effective. It's like, yeah, I think it depends on who you're talking to, but a lot of people are like convinced by like, you know, that just like expressing how you feel about something and how, you know, you have changed your behavior in some way. And they can be quite put off if you're just like putting a bunch of facts on them and kind of just saying like, yeah, well, why aren't you already like changing your dietary behavior? So I think, yeah, I would definitely advocate for like bringing a more personable approach to it. And I don't think that means like you just can't speak about the facts at all, because I think that is important and that would definitely convince some people. I think it's like, think about who you're talking to and like from your knowledge, what do you think they're motivated by, and then try and target that. And I mean, in my experience, I've convinced people to like give up meat, not by saying like, oh, it's like, you know, it's a terrible thing and it kills this many animals and that sort of thing, but by saying like, oh, this is the reasons I did it. Like, if you want, you know, if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm not going to push it on you. And that can be really hard, because if you really believe something, you probably really want to communicate it and like really convince other people, but it's not necessarily answer like to go and be aggressive about it.
All right, thanks for that, Kieran and Emily. Just to finish wrapping up, obviously got to plug EA Unimelb. If you're not a regular with us, then definitely check out our stuff on Facebook, and also check out Alternative Protein Initiative if you are particularly interested in kind of alternatives to animal products. And just to tell people about some upcoming events that you might want to come to, our next main event is the Effective and Impactful Research Careers Q&A panel, which is 5 p.m. next Friday. and has two speakers, Bianca and Madeline, who also work in food and agriculture research. So related topic. And also we have Jonas Sandbrink, who's from the Future of Humanity Institute, which will be very amazing. And we also have two game nights. One of them is tomorrow at 8 p.m. for One for the World, and then there's another at 8 p.m. next Thursday for EA. And yeah, that's everything. Thanks, guys. And thanks to the people who organised, which is Patrick and Alistair. And most of all, thank you to Emily for your amazing presentation and all your great insight. Yay! This event is concluded. Thanks everyone again for coming.
Having me.